Well, hello, P Street people, and whoever else might be joining us. So I'm in quarantine. This is January the 30th. Brittany tested positive, I guess, on Thursday. So the family and I are essentially stuck inside, at least the kids and I, until Friday. And then if we test negative, if all of us test negative on Friday, then we can break out of quarantine. Brittany, really, this would be her last day of quarantine from the onset of her symptoms. So, anyway, I did sneak away here to the office so that I could, you know, get in another installment of our study of Colossians. We have this lesson and one more, and then we will have completed a study of every verse in this book. I've enjoyed this study. It's been eye opening at times. I mean, there's just some things that in discussions you're not going to be aware of unless you really dig into a book and you get into the secondary literature and where people are wrestling with the contents of it, and it's just been a good study, a challenging study on several different fronts. So I hope for those of you that have been able to kind of tune in, I hope you felt the same way about it. So we're gonna look at, as we always do, our outline. This is just to kind of give our study of the book some structure. And if I make this a little bit bigger, you can see that we are actually in the section on submission to Christ. And we're going to be looking at chapter 4, verses 2 through 6 this evening. And then we will we'll cover those final greetings and just make some observations as we look through that litany of names next week. And there's some interesting names mentioned there with some interesting backstories, and so we'll take a look at that next week. Here is my little outline for just this section on submission to Christ that starts in chapter 3, verse 1. We looked at the position of believers, and then in about verse 5, you get the practice of believers. And then I broke that larger section into three parts. Ethical exhortations, so that's the putting off of the old self and putting on the new self. Then we had domestic directives, and that was last week where we looked at the household, wives and husbands, children and parents, slaves and masters. And of course, that led us down some paths of questions and things that we had to kind of work through with the time we had. And then tonight's lesson, I've got the heading here, Missional Mandates. And as we're about to see, the final instructions in this submission to Christ section have two imperatives, just two. And there's two units with two imperatives. So you got verses 2 through 4, and then you got verses 5 and 6. And so we have these, that's what we'll do. Both of these imperatives are attached to a greater or lesser extent to the mission of the church, to preaching the gospel, to sharing the gospel with outsiders. So the first mandate is be watchful in prayer. Be watchful in prayer. Here is the first imperative here. Even though you've got three verses, there's only one imperative and one command, and that is continue steadfastly in prayer. That concept of persisting in prayer, that takes us back to, I think, the early disciples after Jesus' ascension. We see them praying, getting together, praying a lot. They prayed when they were going to replace Judas. The early church, Acts 2:42 in that section, they were daily coming together and devoting themselves to prayer. And then not only that, but you find this imperative in other letters that Paul wrote. So, for instance, in Romans 12:12, he says, "Be constant in prayer." And then the one that many of us are familiar with in 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 17, "Pray without ceasing." And that, folks have questions. Well, what does that mean, pray without ceasing? Well, obviously, it is biologically impossible to pray 24/7. It's practically impossible, psychologically impossible. That's not what it's calling us to. Is, hey, bow and pray nonstop until you leave this world. Well, we got to eat, we got to work, we got to take care of things. Yes, it is possible to keep sort of a conscious awareness of God as we go throughout our day and in everything we do. But I think all in all, this is saying prioritize prayer. Give it a good chunk of your life. Focus on it. And that, of course, is an act of faith. I could certainly improve here. Perhaps you can too. It's easy to get busy. It's easy to get busy with those other things and not pray. But Paul says, continue steadfastly in prayer. And then there are a couple of participles that he attaches to this, one of which the ESV obscures. The first participle is being watchful. The second one is actually found in verse 3, right where it says, "Pray also for us." That sounds like an imperative, but and it's translated like that, but it's really a participle. Continue steadfastly in prayer, being watchful in it, and praying, which I know kind of seems redundant, but it is a participle. So let's look at those two, okay, because there's a lot attached to them. Being watchful. Some people interpret that in terms of Jesus's parables about, hey, the Lord's return is going to be in an unknown hour, and so you should always be alert and be ready for his return. We can't summarily dismiss that, but maybe the nuance here is that Paul is warning against spiritual laziness, and that some temptation can steal upon us. It's kind of like in the Garden of Gethsemane. Remember when Jesus prays, but then he'll break and go back to his disciples, and he tells them, "Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation." That may be more of the sense here in Colossians 4, being watchful in it. And then notice this prepositional phrase, with thanksgiving. So yet again, the note for thanksgiving is sounded in the book of Colossians. And if you've been with me on this journey through Colossians, you know that every chapter there is a call to thanksgiving or to give thanks. That is really kind of the default mode from which Christians are to operate, because we realize that we do stand in debt to God, and that we ought to be extremely appreciative for everything that he's done for us in our behalf. And that's going to fuel our lives and what we do with our lives. And then we see the second participle. Okay, at the same time, pray also for us. That we could add the ing to that if we wanted to, make that participle more apparent here. But at the same time, pray also for us. So Paul's going to ask for some intercessory prayer here. And it's only fitting because if you go back to chapter 1, Paul had been praying unceasingly for them. Paul had been entering into prayer on their behalf. And so here it's kind of like, hey, let's reciprocate that, please. Please, I need you to reciprocate by praying for us, for me, and for my missionary companions. And it's interesting what he doesn't ask them to pray for. And I found this from Albright. This is what he said. He said he did not ask for his brothers and sisters in Christ to pray that he would receive money, or even receptive hearts, or many responses and conversions, or an easy schedule, or freedom for hardships, comfortable accommodations, obedience of the rich and famous, large and prestigious congregations, or any other physical convenience. That's an interesting list that Albright put together. And there is, as I look back over that list, I don't necessarily see anything that in and of itself would be wrong. It's just interesting that here Paul simply asks that God would open a door for the word. Now, as you can see here, if you go down a little bit further into verse 3, when he talks about declaring the mystery of Christ, he wants an open door for the word, that is, so he can declare the mystery of Christ on account of which he is in prison. So sometimes preaching the gospel does not win friends and influence people. For Paul, it landed him in jail on multiple occasions. Colossians, again, is among the prison epistles. You got Colossians and Philippians, Ephesians and Philemon. And, it's at least, demonstrating that sometimes preaching the gospel will open a door to a prison cell, at least for these Colossians, and certainly in that setting, in that place and time, would more likely open a prison cell door than it would open up someone to fame and a windfall of money or prestige, right? And it's interesting that Paul is imprisoned, and he's wanting an open door for the word. Now, is he subtly asking that he may be released? Because if he is released, he would have unhindered, the unhindered ability to preach the word, sort of an unrestricted access to the world. But let's just take him for what he says here. He wants the word to get out. He wants the gospel to be proclaimed. And we know, interestingly, in the Philippians letter, that the word had made incredible progress, even though Paul was imprisoned. That the gospel was being preached to those of, within the Roman cohorts, and that the gospel was advancing despite the fact that Paul was imprisoned. Now, he says here that he wants to declare the mystery of Christ. And if you go back to chapter 1 and even chapter 2, you'll see that we discuss this concept. And you put it in a nutshell, it is God's purpose to reconcile the world through Christ. And that world includes not just the Jews, but also the Gentiles. And this whole plan to save man is certainly discernible in the Old Testament, especially in hindsight. But so many people just didn't see it coming in to the first century. They had their own ideas about what the Messiah would be like, what the Messiah would come to accomplish. But here, he's wanting to declare it. He's wanting to proclaim the mystery of Christ. Christ is, of course, the center of this mystery. Even at one point, the mystery, he says, is Christ. Okay? And that's what he did for us and all the implications of that. And then you'll notice that in verse 4, it says, that I may make it clear which is how I ought to speak. Now, the ESV's translation here suggests that Paul has the responsibility to proclaim the word so that people will not misunderstand, so that the message is clear to all. But the verb used here could just as easily be translated to make known or to announce or proclaim, which, in this context, when you're talking about a mystery being revealed, the concept of making it manifest, of proclaiming it, announcing it, or making it known does fit. So I'm just saying, you want to get technical here. Some say, hey, this word could be translated without any sort of connotation of intelligibility or clarity of the message. In some ways you think that would go without saying. I mean, we want people to understand what it is we're trying to communicate. And then which is how I ought to speak is also another kind of interesting phrase. The way it's worded here, almost suggests making the message appropriate for a given audience. But there is the implication of oughtness. So some translations have as I should do, or as I am bound to do. And in that case, it would point to Paul's commission, right, as a preacher, as a missionary. Okay? So your first imperative here is continue steadfastly in prayer. And I want you to notice that as these verses unfold, Paul is asking them to pray. It's kind of a missional prayer, that a door will be opened for the word. And just think about that. I mean, that's what he wants them to pray for. It's just sometimes what a person's not asking for is just as interesting and telling as what they are asking for. And then we move to the second mandate here: be wise in reaching outsiders. So the second imperative is literally translated in the ESV as walk in wisdom. Other translations have things like be wise in the way you act. So walk here, peripateo, refer to a person's conduct or behavior or lifestyle. And the call here is to walk in wisdom toward outsiders. The concern for outsiders, which is literally those on the outside, that would be those that are outside Christ's church or body, non-Christians. Okay, that concern for outsiders is found and reflected elsewhere in the New Testament. One of my favorites is just in the very next book after Colossians, in 1 Thessalonians. And in 1 Thessalonians, verses 9 through 12 I should say 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 9 through 12. I'll just read this for you. Here's what Paul said there. Now concerning brotherly love, you have no need for anyone to write to you, for you yourselves have been taught by God to love one another. For that indeed is what you are doing to all the brothers throughout Macedonia. But we urge you, brothers, to do this more and more, and to aspire to live quietly, and to mind your own affairs, and to work with your hands as we instructed you, so that you may walk properly before outsiders and be dependent on no one. Paul calls attention to love, right? Right prior to that, he calls attention to holiness in terms of sexual purity and work ethic, living a quiet, peaceful life, and all of that with a view toward outsiders. So there are several passages where outsiders are discussed, and this reminds us that Christians in general, are to share the responsibility of evangelizing outsiders. It's not just a job for located preachers and traveling evangelists. It's for all of us. He is telling the church of Colossae, walk in wisdom toward outsiders. Pay attention to your reputation. Pay attention to the impression that you're leaving with outsiders. Paul, I think, knew only too well the importance of not giving the world a reason to criticize or gossip about the behavior of Christians. A blameless life lays a foundation for effective evangelism. The precise manner of the conduct that the apostle's commending to his readers is somewhat ill-defined. I mean, he says walk in wisdom, yeah, but then he says making the best use of time. And there are a couple of ways in which people have understood this, okay? There's kind of two, I think, distinct interpretations of this phrase, but some kind of conflate the two. So one idea is something like just take advantage of the available time. That there is a urgency here, okay? That we've only got so much time, and we need to use that time wisely. That we need to have a sense of urgency in sharing the gospel and the relationships that we build with outsiders and all of that. Others have really tried to focus on the idea of redeeming the time or buying back time, and there is, rescuing time, as it were. And again, maybe it all kind of ends up in the same place. I think Garland, he wrote, and he kind of has both ideas, but I think he strikes at what exactly Paul is getting at here. He says they must blend wisdom with a sense of urgency that exhausts every opportunity to reach unbelievers. So you will also find in Ephesians 5:15 and 16 the same concepts. Look carefully then how you walk, not as unwise but wise, making the best use of time, because the days are evil. If there's one difference between Colossians and Ephesians, it's that Colossians applies this to our behavior before a watching world, before outsiders. Now, Paul does not want them to be fearful or isolated. He wants them to speak openly with others. And he gives three characteristics here in verse 6 of their speech. Three characteristics that should govern their speech. The first one is their words should always be gracious. Civility, graciousness can overcome the misgivings of neighbors and make them more receptive to the message. I think we understand that. Gracious speech forms a contrast with the sins of speech that are listed in chapter 3, verses 8 and 9 that we looked at, okay, in an earlier lesson. So I think we understand what Paul is asking for here. Unkind, caustic, hateful speech is not going to make the right impression on people, and it's certainly not going to soften their hearts or open their hearts to listen to what we have to say. And then seasoned with salt. There, in our idiom, salty language is language that is full of profanity. So it's really important to understand this from a first century perspective. I mean, he is in a sense saying we want your language to be salty, but certainly not salty in the 21st century sense, but in a first century sense. And then we ask, okay, well, what does that idiom mean? What does it mean to have language that is seasoned with salt? Well, it would refer to witty, amusing, clever, even humorous speech. The saltiness of their speech will prevent them from being dismissed as irrelevant bores, okay? N.T. Wright, I like how he captured this, said the metaphor of salty speech was a common one in the ancient world. Paul knows that a tedious monologue is worse than useless in evangelism. Christians are to work at making their, and he uses the word witness here, interesting, lively, and colorful. Right? And that's a challenge. It is. Our speech should be gracious, but there should be a relevancy. It's that we have really thought through the truths of Christianity, and we're able to be conversational about them. And that kind of, in some ways, is going to tie in with what comes next here, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. Because believers live in a hostile context, they need to have their answers ready for those who challenge or are curious about their faith. We find this idea in 1 Peter chapter 3, 15 and 16 as well, that we're to always be ready. We got to always be ready to give a reason for the hope that is within us. And that implies that people are gonna come asking, and we've got to be ready to respond to them, to their particular situation or their particular question. And so, if Christians really focused on mastering these three characteristics, graciousness, saltiness in a first century context, and then preparedness, right? Being prepared, as it were, to know how we ought to answer each person, to be well grounded in our faith so that we can answer someone when they ask us about why we believe what we believe. There is just some incredibly wonderful practical advice here that those of us who are Christians cannot overlook. We cannot treat every human being as if it's a one-size-fits-all. As if this method, we're going to use this method and only this method for every person. We don't care about their differences in personality, their differences in understanding, their differences in background. We've got to be a lot more flexible than that. And I hear that coming through in this passage as well. So what I want to do here to kind of transition just briefly to something you could kind of preach. It's put in more of a preacher's outline, I guess, is what I'll call 4 stages of sharing the gospel with outsiders. And so I did the wonderful alliteration thing and just to kind of roll this out. And I also brought together not just Colossians 4, but the passage I mentioned in 1 Peter chapter 3. And so let me just share these with you as we are, hold on one second, as we're finishing up here. All right. 1, prepare your heart and mind. This is us kind of starting at the end, because this is understood, right? If we're going to share the gospel with outsiders, we've got to be prepared. The passage over in 1 Peter chapter 3, I quoted just a portion of it to you, but it would probably do well for me to share the whole thing. So, or those 2 verses. But here's what you got. But in your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy. He's set apart. He is the dominant force in your life. Always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Notice, there's a prepared heart, and there is a prepared mind. Okay? And then, secondly, pray for the lost in your life. Now, when I say this, I'm not so much thinking of us praying, Lord, make this person become a Christian. Lord, I want this person to be saved, so please, hijack their heart and turn it to you. Okay? We have to, I think, respect the freedom that God has given us, the free will, as it were. But I think it's entirely okay to pray for open doors, similar to what Paul prayed here, an open door for the Word. And maybe we can make it specific to certain people in our lives that we have come in contact with, that we have established friendships with, relationships with, that we're concerned about, that whose souls we love, and so we pray for an open door. We pray for the courage to seize those opportunities as they come our way, as we see them. But I think it's okay to pray for the lost in our life. We just need to make sure that we're not praying for something that God is just not going to do. Okay. Here's a third thing: present a Christ-like example to the lost in your life. The 1 Peter 3:16 goes on and says, having a good conscience, so that when you're slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. Colossians 4:5, walk in wisdom. Be wise in the way you act before or toward outsiders. We have to present to them a Christ-like example. They ought not associate with us hatred, for them. We are to love all people, even our enemies, even. So, Christ-like example, and that's what they should see. That is us shining our lights, as it were. And then finally, we have proclaim the good news in gentleness when appropriate. This is where, of course, the second part of verse 15. After Peter says, make a defense to anyone who asks you for the reason of hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect. And then add to that what we've got in Colossians from Paul: graciousness, saltiness in a first century context, right? That we've given forethought to how we might answer different people in different situations. That we're paying attention not just to what we're saying, but we're paying attention to how we're saying it. It's vastly important when we are trying to share the gospel with outsiders. So I do think that, this is some immensely practical, helpful advice that we get in this kind of closing section of the submission to Christ part of the letter to the Colossians. And then next week, we'll pick up with verse 7 and go through the end of the chapter. And if you were to read ahead, you see that there are going to be a lot of names and greetings. But there's also embedded in there some interesting things that are worth highlighting and talking about before we bring our study of Colossians to a close. And then I'll just remind you that once we're done next week, at least for this foreseeable future, I will not be putting any content out like this on Sunday nights. I've been doing it for for a while now. And going to take a break from that and again focus on our feast nights together. And if you're able to be here for feast night, that's the first, second, and third Sundays of each month at 5:30, weather permitting or COVID permitting, it seems. And we'll get together and have a meal and a devotional time together. And I just think in this day and time, I think it's good and it's beneficial, at least for our church family. So anyway, hey, thanks for sticking with me and for joining me. I hope again that it's been a good study thus far. Thanks for watching.